The following content reflects the personal opinions and perspectives of the hosts. These views do not necessarily represent those of their employers.
Good morning and welcome to episode 8 of the Blue Sky Business Acquisitions podcast, titled The Spooky Turns of an M&A Transaction. And today we have the honored guest of Scott Oliver, who is an attorney for the banks. He is a director of at Lewis and Kappes Attorneys. Scott, we'd love to welcome you to the episode here. But before we do that, let's talk about what a spooky turn of an SBA or M&A transaction is. You know, after 20 years of doing this, and I know, Ben, you'll agree with a lot of these points, a seller goes out to market with the best intentions. They want to achieve a goal, they want to retire, they want to move on to the next phase of their life. They talk to a broker like myself and Tom. We go out, we market, we find a buyer. Now we're entering into negotiation, and buyers sometimes have weird requests. What are those? Is that working capital? Is it a long-term transition period? And on the same term, sellers have some really weird requests. You know, I want to be out in 3 months. I want to do this. I want to do this. I'm not leaving you this. I'm not doing this. Oh, by the way, the employee is going to come with me because I'm going to go start a side business over here. Lots of really strange things can happen in these one-off transactions. And, you know, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you here in just a second, but I know I'm excited to hear your viewpoint of being that third-party attorney that steps in kind of at the finish line to say, what is going on? So the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. These things are really important, not for just the four of us on here, but all of your audience members as well. But I am a partner here at Lewis Kappes. We're based in Indianapolis, but we do deals in all 50 states. To date, you know, we've done thousands of different SBA transactions in all 50 states. I'm just one of 18 of our SBA department here. So all 18 of us are 100% SBA lender side 100% of the time. So while I might be on your transaction, I also have some incredibly talented associate attorneys, partners, closing paralegals, et cetera, that really eat, sleep, and breathe SBA all the time. So this topic of spookiness in SBA deals is really relevant because we've probably seen a thing or two when it comes to some scary or some hairy situations that come about. But we also focus on, you know, the great closings that we have. Not only are there situations where there is something bad that goes wrong, but how do you turn that negative into a positive and figure out how to get that deal to the finish line in a way that's compliant? And compliance is really the key there.
No, absolutely. And one of the things we tell all of our sellers is that your deal will die 3 times. And so creative solves, as it would be, is a good way to be. So with that, Ben, I'd like to hand this episode over to yourself to kind of talk a little bit about what you see on the front line of the Main Street, lower middle market, being a banker for the last 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. I think the biggest thing when you look at a deal is that runs into issues. It has to do something with maybe a misrepresentation or some unknown disclosed fact, right? Or things like that. Or someone does something, for example, prior to the close of the deal, right, that changes the deal, right? And so those are all things that can happen within an SBA loan, right? And and I think the biggest thing for a buyer and a bank is to have your eyes wide open and pay attention to potential flags that show up on a deal and realize that those things can be issues down the road. So but a lot of it has to do with either a misrepresentation or not. Maybe the buyer didn't understand how to run the business. There's a lot of variety of different things that can go into having a deal go south, right? But those are some of them.
No, absolutely. And, you know, Scott, you're when you represent the banks, you're coming in after the fact. So you're coming in after negotiation is done, after, the draft APA or SPA is done, or, you're coming in kind of after the fact. So, we had a broad variety of topics today, which include environmental, contract issues, some economic issues, culture, vendor, legal, personal, spousal support is a big one, insurance issues and government policies. But I know that you've brought some pretty specific ideas up that are relevant to today's market. I guess share your thoughts when it comes to the misrepresentation and maybe touch on some of those topics in regards to the third party attorney that's coming in after the fact.
Yeah, and it's an important thing to consider is who is coming in after the fact as well. So first, a little bit of background is we normally will get a file once a commitment letter is signed. And something I always tell our clients is the sooner the better. And the reason that I'm saying the sooner the better at commitment is because in some instances, you're right, it's after the fact, there's already a contract, but other times it's just an LOI. Or other times it's a rough draft of a contract that perhaps hasn't been signed yet. And in those situations, we're able to come in, review the entire deal, review that draft contract, and very quickly figure out, oh, this is a compliance issue. This is a guarantee issue, or this is something that the bank needs to consider from a structural perspective. And in those situations, if we have an unsigned contract at that time, it's relatively simple. I guess I shouldn't say simple necessarily, but it should be simple to be able to get all of the relevant parties on a call or on an email chain and just say, hey, we took a look at this. Here are the issues. This isn't eligible for SBA financing, but here's how it could be eligible. Or there are some problems here that are going to cause some real headaches down the road. How are we going to alleviate those headaches before that happens? And in some situations, there's counsel on the other side that has done, plenty of SBA transactions and understands the market. Other times, there might not be an attorney involved in a business acquisition. Whether or not that's a good idea, I'll let you guys make your own assumptions there. But that's one side of the extreme of not having anybody involved in a transaction. The middle ground is that, niche expert who might really know SBA transactions. Or we get a situation where somebody gets on the deal who maybe is accustomed to $100 million plus transactions that take years to conclude. They're not familiar with lower to middle market deals. All of those different types of attorneys have their pros and cons. But the biggest thing to be able to do in that situation is to be able to get on the phone or get an introductory email flowing so that we can all just lay the groundwork at the very beginning, sketch out a plan for the closing, and figure out how to do it in a manner that, one, from my perspective, protects the bank's SBA guarantee. That's my job, right? But on the other hand, it helps the buyer and seller understand what they have to do to cross the finish line without the spooky things that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, spooky turns of an M&A transaction. I love this topic. This is actually the episode that has had me kind of excited the most, right? And I talked about it in an earlier episode when we come to environmental issues, right? And I love this conversation because, Tom, you and I were at a client somewhat recently, and there's a paint booth on site. And we're like, what happens to the overspray? What's your ventilation look like? You got some, underground tanks here that might be an issue, and kind of identifying that. But, as a buyer, if you're going through a transaction and you're buying a real estate that has a potential environmental issue, a phase 1, phase 2, could potentially be some remediation issues there. It's good to get ahead of that. Now, Scott, when you look at a transaction and, we have an RSRA issue or we have a phase 1 issue, walk us through the actual risk that the bank has when it comes to that. Yeah, that's the question I always get.
Yeah, there are specific requirements too. If there is risk, the bank has to go through the steps from a phase 1. If there are continuing issues, phase 2, et cetera. On those environmental type reports, Ben can probably speak more to this, but banks usually have internal vendors and internal people that they go through to have those environmental aspects vetted. And phase 1s and phase 2s can take a lot of time. They can be costly. And all the while those things are happening and it's a real estate purchase, us on the legal side, we're working with the title company. because the title company has probably issued a preliminary title commitment, and these issues might have come up. Or there might be recorded documents that talk about tanks or talk about certain types of restrictions that we have to really consider and read through to make sure that the guarantee is protected. But on the internal side, yeah, banks, if they're finding some sort of contaminants or it is a project property, they're running those reports, and those reports have to be cleared in order for that transaction to close.
Yeah, usually when you get a report from the state agency that is reviewing the environmental report, right, or the environmental company that does it, it specifically outlines what needs to be done to remedy the property. And it's those guidance aligned with the SBA standard operating procedure that allow the bank to make a decision on what they can do to move forward on the deal. Phase one can obviously lead to a phase two, and in that scenario can require environmental cleanup, right? Because the last thing we as a bank want is to have a deal go south and then be holding the bag on an environmental issue.
And from our end, Matt, what we're thinking about in those situations, as Ben is alluding to, if we get worst case scenario, the deal closes, things go south, there's a default, and we have to liquidate the collateral. Collateral real estate with an environmental issue, people don't want to touch that. You're then have paid a certain amount of money for real estate that essentially just sits there as a paperweight. It can't be moved, or if it's moved, it's sold at such a discount. SBA is going to think not too kindly about that situation. So we have to be crossing our T's, we have to be dotting our I's, and as Ben said, lots of times those reports will outline, here's the issue, here's the remediation that it's going to take, and again, that can look very different, deal to deal, property to property, etc.
And we definitely saw those issues coming out of the Great Recession in 08 and 09, where there were quite a few properties at lenders that they had to hold on to tied to environmental, where ultimately I believe that in a lot of those situations, the banks were required to do the cleanup prior to putting the property back on market.
Yeah.
Well, that's always a fun little turn. Oh, by the way, let me drop $100,000 before I can resell this because if the business failed. Oh, well, thanks for sharing that, guys. One big sticking point for brokers, right, is the contracts. Whether it is a state offer form, which is a binding document, or it is an IOI, or it's for those, it's an indication of interest, right, super high level, or it's an LOI, letter of intent. Periodically, we're working on a transaction right now where we are actually getting a fully prepared asset purchase agreement as an offer, right? But you had mentioned earlier, Scott, you get invited to the call, we'll call it, right, at the time of the signed commitment letter. So what type of contract issues have you seen over the years that we would consider to be kind of a spooky turn?
I would say a lot of it has to do with getting a contract that's not SBA compliant. I keep going back to the regulations and eligibility. I know it's a little bit boring, but in our eyes, if we see that is a little bit spooky. Because if we get a contract and there is something in there, and we can talk about different things that could be in there, but if we get a contract and there's something that makes the transaction not eligible for SBA financing, that is a wrench that's thrown into the arena, because at that point we have to go to the bank and say we can't do this deal and have our guarantee intact, which then means Ben has to go to the parties and say, hey, buyer and seller, I know you have this contract, but we can't close that because there are these issues, right? He points those out, and yes, you can remedy them in certain situations, but other times, if they don't understand how SBA transactions work, that might spook a seller. That might cause a buyer to say, no, I'm not interested. But most of the time, if you catch it early, say it's in an LOI, that'd be great. But if you catch it early and it's open and honest communication about what you can and cannot do on an SBA finance transaction, it's just a conversation. But some of those things, just to kind of outline a few, a big one that you'll see are earnouts. Sellers obviously love earnouts, right? Who wouldn't? Earnouts aren't SBA eligible. So if you see one in a contract, you have to figure out how to get that gone. And there are situations where there are, buyer-friendly aspects where a buyer says, why can't I include that in the contract if it benefits me? for instance, if you have a seller note that has a provision within it that has a forgiveness clause, right? They can't use that as injection. It's not allowed. Even if it benefits the buyer, you can't use a seller note with a forgiveness clause as injection. On the other hand, you can structure it as a contingent seller note with rebates, right? That is benefit to the buyer if it's not being used as injection. And that's a really big common misconception. And sometimes that causes a little bit of tension between the parties because, if you have a SBA attorney saying, hey, bank, you can't do this because of SBA and eligibility concerns, but they look at you and you say, but this benefits the buyer. Why in the world can't we do that? Well, there are reasons, and we can certainly go into that if you're interested in that. But there are reasons why an injection seller note has to now, under SOP 5010A, be on full standby for the life of the loan in order to be considered injection. There are other avenues if it's not injection, but if it's injection, it's black and white. There are some pretty strict rules that must be followed.
No, absolutely. And you actually used a word earlier, and you said communication, right? Parties that do not communicate, I think, automatically create a spooky transaction because there's a lot of unknowns when you don't communicate. And when we start talking about policy, we start talking about structure, I mean, you got to have communication.
Yeah, most of the time, even if that is a situation that isn't ideal, as long as it's caught at the very outset, and you sketch that plan like I started with in this episode, you sketch that plan towards closing. You say, here's what has to happen in order for the bank to close this deal, and you do it early. That is a whole lot easier to swallow than if you wait until a week before closing and all of the parties are suddenly like, oh wait, there's this huge issue that nobody talked about. Okay, now I'm upset. Now I'm upset at the bank. Now I'm upset at the seller. Seller's upset at the buyer, and everybody is just scrambling. If you catch it early and you talk through the issues rather than seeing it, as a nail and you're the hammer, that's going to be a much better outcome and a much better likelihood that the deal is actually going to close. And that separates, I'm speaking for attorneys, like buyer and seller attorneys and bank counsel, from great buy side, sell side, or bank counsel, and not so great buy side, sell side, or bank counsel. That communication is everything for the clients.
Speaking of communication, so sometimes there's communication between landlord, right? Maybe the seller is leasing and the buyer is approaching the landlord to set up a new lease. What have you seen in those scenarios that could go negatively, and how have you righted the ship, or how do you communication's huge, right, to potentially fix that, but how do you right the ship and overcome those spooky turns?
Yeah, landlords can be really tough. They can be barriers to closing in some situations because the landlord's getting presented with a document and they're saying, I don't know this lender. Why do I care? Well, the landlord should
Right.
care because we, the bank, are financing his or her tenant to operate at the location and to, in turn, pay his or her rent. So they should care. But it does scare them when they see that in front of them. And what we've ran into sometimes is most banks will have a form landlord's waiver. Some of them call it a lessor's agreement to be a little less scary, right? Landlord waiver, lessor's agreement, subordination agreement, whatever you want to call it. It's a document that's sent over to the landlord. They'll take a look at it and they may say, kick rocks, I'm not signing a dang thing, right? At that point, I want to get in and just say, this is what the document is. This is why we're requiring it. And yes, there are certain aspects of it that we have to have and things that we cannot agree to as a bank. But at the end of the day, if we want to talk through this thing and get it done and not just be a black and white document that you have to sign or the deal's done, that's a much better situation than just being so point blank about it. It can be a conversation, but letting them know we're going to have this document. This is what we need to see. This is the lowest we can go, or this is how we have to proceed is really important. And not to beat the dead horse or anything, but it comes down to often an early communication. You don't want to put that on the landlord's desk and say, hey, by the way, we're closing in 7 days. That landlord then feels pinched in a corner. You want to see that landlord waiver right around the commitment, quite honestly. Ben, you can chime in correct me if I'm wrong there. But the sooner that that landlord has it, the more time that we have to speak with them, talk to them, get them in a position to sign the document, or if it's an absolute no-go, talk about what that looks like with the bank, talk about the risks, talk about, what options we might have given the space, the collateral, all sorts of different things that we could go down.
Yeah, and I think this is a situation where like a broker who knows the business that they're selling, right, knows what type of landlord we're dealing with, whether it be the seller, a local landlord, or it's a national landlord, or it's part of a REIT, right? Because that can change the dynamic of how tough the negotiation is going to be on the lease, right? So I agree with Scott, the landlord waiver, get it into the landlord's hand as early as possible. If the business is dependent on the location, have the landlord understand that the lease needs to have the option to renew out to 10 years, right? And address those things early on in the process, because I have seen where international landlords, REIT landlords, out-of-state landlords have been very difficult to deal with when trying to get a lease negotiated, and they can really drag out the transaction or kill the deal.
Yeah, landlords, it's always that third party variable that, you never know how they're going to react. Hopefully they react good. Now, I want to kind of shift gears here. We're talking a lot about structure and we're talking about like an SBA loan, but I want to talk a little bit about culture, right? I feel like 2025 has been a big shift between sellers and buyers wanting to not only make the right financial deal, but they want to have the right buyer to help fit into their culture, right? So one of the things when we look at SBA, the bank has to make a character decision on a buyer. Are they the right buyer for this? Yes, they have the right experience. Yes, they have the right liquidity. They're located in the right space, right? But I think personal habits, personality, I think in a lot of cases can cause some spooky adjustments to a transaction. Because if you have a seller who is very quiet, right? They're very thoughtful. They've been doing it for 20 years and they're just very soft spoken. And your buyer is very loud, very out there. They have experience, but sometimes a loud voice trumps the quiet voice. And even though you have an accepted transaction, maybe that doesn't create the level of trust that you thought it was going to. So I'd like to hear you guys chime in on that.
Yeah, so I think character is defined throughout the transaction that you're working on and throughout the deal. And as you're working with a buyer, with the bank and with the seller, right, that character is being written as you are moving through the deal. And it's also written post close as well too. So like, let's say for example, you're difficult to deal with during the entire process of the closing, right? That's probably going to play out post close as well too. So me as a banker, I'm paying attention to that, right? Because are you going to be easy to work with post close? Or if we need to get something from you, are we going to be able to work with you, right? Or are you going to like not get us what we need? And that goes true for the seller as well too. If we see things early on in the process where the seller's withholding information or delaying it, right? That's delaying our ability to make a credit decision, right? Or changing the terms of the agreement, right? And that are not necessarily more beneficial to the buyer, right? We're looking at those things and we're paying attention to them. It's like I said earlier, it's those little red flags that are popping up as you're going through the deal as to whether or not you close the deal or not. You can say, even though you've approved a loan, you can say after you're working through it, you do have the right to say, I don't think I want to do this deal.
And Matt, I don't have a ton to add to that, but just because I don't necessarily vet the deals between buyer and seller and see those personalities. But earlier in my career, I did a decent amount of buy side work, so I've seen both ends of it. And at that time, when I'm looking at transactions and we're talking just generally with buyers, it's, what does this seller's business look like? If this seller is in the business of people, right? Yeah, sure, you're continuing on the business, but you're stepping into this entity's shoes, and this is how the seller has treated his or her people. Are you walking into a landmine, so to speak? And you usually can pick up on that, at least you could on the buy side, but now on the bank side, when I just see so many different ones, it's more of a high level. You don't have a finger on the pulse necessarily to what happens post closing, but sometimes I'll have deals where I just get the sense like this is perfect. Like this is a good business and it is a good seller who is good to his or her employees. We've got a motivated buyer who's stepping into the shoes. It's a great relationship. Like that is so fun to see. And it's not every transaction, but those types of dynamics, you get to just get that feeling that these people are going to be successful or not. It's interesting.
Well, one of the things that I do, every single transaction, whether it be seller or buyer, I go out to Google and I just type someone's name in there. And if they got an Instagram account, that pops up. They got a Facebook account, that pops up. And I think in the world of social media, you get a really easy glimpse into someone's life. And for the buyers out there, and for the sellers for that matter, making your profile private, I think it's key, right? We don't need to know what your habits are on a Friday night, especially when you're looking at buying a daycare, as an example. So, vendor issues and transferable contracts has always been, something that derails a transaction. The question is always, is this contract transferable? Can I acquire it? It's always a part of a diligence item. As far as the bank and the legal side is concerned, how do you guys look at that? And, if a major vendor is not transferable, that's a big issue.
Yeah, I mean that it's true, it is. And most of the time when you have an approval process at the bank, they're looking at that. So if you're buying the business, what are you getting? Right? And buying the business means different things if you're buying the assets of the business versus a stock or membership or equity, whatever you call it, type of transaction where you're literally stepping into the shoes of an entity and you're getting all of those existing types of contracts. Because if you're stepping into the shoes of an entity and the vast majority of that entity's revenue is based on a contract that once you have a change in ownership, it basically deems the contract null and void, that would be a massive, massive issue. So you do want to make sure that if that is something you're relying on as an income stream, one, that as a bank, you've noted that, but two, when you enter into that agreement, your legal counsel is looking at that and saying, yeah, we're totally fine here. That revenue is going to be here post-closing and we're not going to have a problem. Because if it's not, that could be the difference of a default or a very successful loan.
Scott, are you reviewing that, or is that Ben? Ben, are you, or both?
As far as what the revenue stream, like determining
the contracts, language.
Yeah, so it's something that I look at when I'm betting a deal, right? Like if there are specific contracts in place, like that's usually a sign that it probably needs to be a stock purchase, especially when the contracts need to be in the name of the business, right? And they're not able to move over with an asset purchase agreement, right? So we are definitely vetting whether or not the revenue stream is going to be continuing post-close, because as Scott said, if we don't have it, then we don't have a payment for our loan. And we don't want to do many of those.
Yeah. Well, where I'll see that is in the bank approval usually. If a bank has an approval, they have a longer write-up typically. And the write-up is going to say something like that, like we're buying this business because this business has this valuable contract. And then that alerts me, hey, when I get into this contract, making sure that everything comes with it, that's actually going to stick with the business. And it's fun to see that too, because when you read these write-ups, you read about the business, you read about their strategies, and you read about, what is going to continue to make them successful in the future. And a lot of times, as Ben said, there are situations where maybe a contract won't transfer via an asset sale. So it has to be a stock sale. So you have a whole new can of worms that you have to go through to figure out how is this going to work, not only structurally, but how is this business going to thrive post closing after there has been, a pretty significant complete or partial, right, change in ownership of the company.
And this really gets to how well the letter of intent or IOI is written, or maybe they have a draft purchase agreement already written up, right? Because like, well, the things that like often I hear, oh, that can wait till later, are the things that are most important to the deal. Things like assignability, working capital, non-compete, consulting, right? Those are all things that impact the overall business, right? And if we as a bank are trying to underwrite to that, the more we know on the front end, the better we are at addressing it in our front end approval. And that's why we push so hard for more of that detail on the front end versus like a one paragraph LOI that doesn't really tell you other than it's some sort of purchase, right? And everything will be defined in negotiation. So that's why early on in my career, one of the things I saw that was a deal killer was weak letters of intent, weak draft purchase agreements, because it left too much to be decided right at the end, and at the at each other, and they're not negotiating anything anymore, and a lot of resources have been wasted to try to get a deal done, and it doesn't happen.
Well, I
Seems
think
like a lot of that, sorry to interrupt, Matt, is the broker, right? Or the brokers in this case, as far as setting the seller up, finding the buyer, matching the right buyer to, and then just kind of putting things together, right? The puzzle pieces. So then it just makes your lives easier. Scott, why don't you kind of go into one, like, how can a broker be a bottleneck or just a big boulder in the road, for you? And then two, how are good brokers, what do good brokers do? Certainly communication, right, is I think that's like a pillar. Any other pillars that you've seen or noticed, or yeah, just kind of compare the, bad broker versus good broker and how that affects your position.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point to make, and I'll call out attorneys on this as well, because there are brokers that are worth their weight in gold. They're absolutely phenomenal. They make transactions, plentiful for the lender, and they make the process much smoother, and they're great. Same thing with attorneys, right? There are some great ones out there.
Mm-hmm.
There are also brokers out there who either do it for the wrong reasons, or they do it the wrong way, or they go about it the wrong way. Those types of people can make the transaction very difficult. Same thing with lender's counsel or buyer's counsel or counsel. If you're always being a brick wall with no reasoning behind it, with no logic to it, with no process, you're going to make the process and the whole entire transaction a negative experience for the customer. So you actually pointed out, well, I think all three of you pointed out something that brokers can do that's really helpful, is when you're getting those types of deals into the bank, having the lines or the colors filled into the transaction as much as possible is really important for us. Because at that point, if Ben has more details about a transaction, he's much in a much better position to have that transaction underwrote appropriately. On my end too, if all of those details, or a lot of the details at least, are filled in when I get the transaction, you're much less likely to have some of those issues that we talked about probably 30 minutes ago, like the seller not understanding, oh, I have to sign Form 155, a standby agreement for a seller note. News to me, right? No, that should be known at the outset. Or no, I have to have a non-compete, credits requiring a non-compete. I had no idea. All right, well, you're 30 years old and you're selling your business and you're going into a similar industry. You didn't think you had to sign a non-compete? Crazy, right? So those types of details on the broker's end can be discovered early on and can be communicated effectively. That makes everyone's lives a lot easier. On the transaction itself, I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag because I don't typically talk with brokers much on transactions unless there is a reason to. Like a broker has a relationship with a certain party, if they have certain details that could help. Most of the time, the best transactions are where the brokers are brought in, at least with legal, when they're needed. Otherwise, you brought the deal in, we'll take it from here, we'll get it done, and we'll get it done well. And you guys communicate when it makes sense. Some brokers, the ones that don't, in my opinion, wouldn't be as effective, are ones that try to be the quarterback on the transaction a little bit too much, almost take the reins over from the bank, from counsel, from the buyer and the seller, and try to be a little bit overzealous. That's difficult. It could be okay if it's done appropriately, but I've had experiences where the broker is there, his or her head is on fire the entire time, and everybody, is against him or her. And this transaction must close tomorrow, or it must close in 48 hours when that's not the case. That makes the transaction less smooth. And those situations or those types of brokers usually have the deal, it closes, and everybody's like, gosh, I didn't like that. That wasn't good. The brokers that are successful are the ones that have the relationship. They're the relationship people. They guide their client. They figure out the things that they need to figure out, but then they step back and say, all right, I know that this is in good hands. The deal closes. Everybody gets paid what they're supposed to get paid. And then they get referred business later. That's the smooth sailing situation that we like to see. And those relationships, I can't say names off the top of my head for confidentiality reasons, but I have people's names going through my head right now. I'm like, they're fantastic. I love seeing their deals. I love it. At the same time, there are certain names in my head that's kind of flying around right now where I'm like, oh yeah, no. Not a good situation. But knowing that going into the transaction is really helpful because we're able to talk to the banks. We're able to kind of smoke screen some things out and make sure that the customer is getting a really good experience and try to make sure that we're putting the people where they need to be to get the deal done.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think
and you
to
go ahead,
second
Ben.
what Scott says, like the brokers that really put together their loan packet and have a nice file to present to the bank, right? Those are deals that easily get through. You have SBA lenders out there with 10 to 20 years of experience, right, in doing deals. So with 10 to 20 years of experience, maybe some of them have 30 years of experience, that they know how to get deals done, right? So if you put the right information in front of them, they'll be able to take that deal and get it done for you quickly. I can't emphasize enough, as in I always say, show your work and like make sure the buyer you're working with is prepared to talk to the bank and be able to articulate what they're looking to do, because those are the types of deals that get done quickly and efficiently because everybody knows what's going on within the deal. I get it. Not every deal can work that way, but that's like, as a banker's eyes, is like the ideal situation is where like you can say, I love this deal. Let's move forward and let's get it into underwriting.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think the interesting thing about our industry is not everything is cookie cutter, right? You have quality brokers, you have quality bankers, you have quality, buy and sell side counsel, closing departments. I mean, I can tell you right now, being a lender in the past, I've worked for banks that have really good upfront BDOs, but their closing department struggles, right? And when we think about how deals fail, if a deal goes through underwriting and gets approved and it goes into closing and it sits there, deal fatigue is a real thing. And then you have, people pushing and leveraging that. It can blow a deal up pretty quickly, right? But yeah, quality brokers, quality bankers, quality CPAs. Squash was on the podcast a few episodes ago. A solid resource for somebody that's out there. Guys, deals will die 3 times, plain and simple. I think it's just, do you have the wherewithal to make it through to find yourself in a successful transaction, right? Without having it fall apart. And, we could go into a whole bunch of different stories as to, this happened and here's why this happened and here's why this deal didn't close, and this, that, and the other thing. But I want to leave the episode with kind of the gleaming topic right now is government policies, right? And kind of the governance of the SBA, because our government's shut down, day 19, which means the SBA can't pull PLP, right? And I hate to say it, but there are some really good deals out there that are probably going to die because of this, right? So Scott, Ben, Tom, I'll leave you guys with the final thoughts before I wrap it up.
Yeah, what I would say is to a deal team that is working through the process of a deal that is in the early stages or maybe is in underwriting, is to let the process play out. The longest shutdown's been 35 days, and eventually the government will open back up, and eventually that deal will close. So as long as you have a team that understands that and is comfortable with letting that wants to go down the SBA route, right, that this process may take a little longer. But look, we're at day 19, which is 16 days away from day 35, right? So the conversation I would have is like, your loan application to underwriting, you take about 2 weeks in underwriting, right? And the bank's going to do all the stuff to close your loan so that when the government does open up, you can get your authorization number. So even with a 35-day delay, hypothetically, and getting that shouldn't really factor into the decision-making process, right? As it relates to the specifics of the government being opened or closed, right? Talking about economics, those are two different things.
Yeah, 100%. And yes, it's going to reopen. These things happen. Will it probably shut down again in the future? Yes. These types of things happen. So hopefully that doesn't deter too many buyers, and hopefully it doesn't deter people from SBA financing, because it really is a wonderful program for entrepreneurs. And yes, it is tied to the government. So we get a little bit of collateral damage when the shutdown occurs, but it will open back up. And during the time between now and when that occurs, banks are still moving. They're still getting your deals in. We're getting some of the due diligence done. The work that needs to get done to close is getting done. It's just a matter, as you guys said, getting that approval from the SBA to close the transaction. Once you get that, it's all feet on the floor running as fast as you can to get that done. But if I had to, say something outside of the shutdown as a takeaway, it's really just doing good work with good people. We spent a lot of this episode talking about, what does an attorney do well? What does a broker do well? What does a lender or an underwriter do well? At the end of the day, there are good apples and there are bad apples. But everybody on this call obviously are the good ones. And if you have people in your corner who know what they're doing and who are pleasant to work with, that deal process is going to be so much smoother. Your certainty to close goes up tremendously. The quality of the product goes up tremendously. So I'm a big believer in, as Ben said, deal teams, and just do that good work with those good people. You'll have good results.
And just to piggyback off, just Scott and Ben, I mean, communication, right? I mean, you got good people, you communicate, and if you're going through a deal, if you're a seller or a buyer right now, with the government shutdown or whatever, if you communicate to your broker, maybe the seller expects to close this year. Can you close this year? Yes or no? That needs to be communicated, between everybody. So then everybody can make the best decision moving forward. And you don't want to have, um, you know, if you don't know where you're at in the deal, that's not a good place to be. So figure it out, communicate, and, work with good people. Good things happen. So with that, Matt, I'll let you close this off.
Well, thanks again, Scott, for your time today. To our listeners out there, the spooky turns of an M&A transaction can mean a variety of different things in your transaction, right? We covered everything from environmental issues all the way to government shutdown, right? Vendor issues, legal issues, your personal habits, right? But there are other things out there that can derail your transaction. Spousal support, right? Getting your spouse on board is incredibly important. Avoiding last minute changes, right? No one likes a latch-dish effort to secure an extra $5,000 in purchase price. And, for all of the people that listen to this, our inboxes are always open. If you got questions, you want to talk through scenarios, you want evaluation, you want to ask Ben about policy, right? We're here for you. Now, I'm super excited about next month. Next month is all about the broker. It's all about the banker. It's all about the attorney, right? And it's about our health. At the end of the day, guys, we work 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and we travel. We go to conferences, right? That seafood tower consistently cycles through my head. The big 24-ounce porterhouse, right? The drinks, the camaraderie. But does that really drive a healthy lifestyle, right? Working 60 hours a week and divulging yourself from your family, does that really lead a healthy lifestyle? Oh, by the way, I got you the Dadarazzi, taking all those photos. Scott, love that photo. It was great. But next month, we're going to have Ryan Collins on. Ryan is another SBA BDO. But the important thing is we're going to cover 2 full decades of professionals. Whether, we're in our 30s, we're in our 40s. We're going to be able to say, what is the day in the life of someone who's expecting a baby to someone who has 3 under the age of 5, right? To someone who has a teenager like myself. And what does that look like? And how do we stay healthy in our lives? And what are our secrets to living a happy, healthy lifestyle? So I encourage everyone to listen in next month. You can always find our episodes on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. And without a doubt, Scott, thanks again so much for your time. Listeners, thanks so much for taking the time today. So
thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.